Welcome to the Madrona Group's 15-minute forms, where today we talk about a form for about 15 minutes in order to develop a better understanding of how to use it in our transactions. Today, I wanted to talk about Form 22AD, which is the additional down payment form, or otherwise known in our industry as the appraisal gap form. So what is it? Well, this is a form that we're going to use if there is any question that the appraised value and the purchase price will have a gap between the two of them. For instance, if it appraises low and the purchase price on the purchase and sale agreement is higher, this is a form that we can insert into our contracts to take care of the difference between those two numbers. Now, this is a one-page form with only two options on it, so I'm going to go through what exactly they mean. Now, we may not see this very regularly right now, but we always are in a moving market where this may come up in our future. Also, if you're working in a competing offer situation and you want to stand out from the other competing offers, making sure that seller knows you're going to be able to cover that if there's a question about the appraisal. This also gives sellers a lot of confidence. So let's talk about when we would use this. Well, like I said before, this is to be used if there is any question whatsoever or escalating amounts being offered over the original price, where you may run into a situation where it would not appraise at that value. So let's look at this form a little bit closer. Basically, there are two different options for the use of this form. The one that you're most commonly going to be using is going to be option number one, because you're going to have a financing addendum, likely, if you're going to have this appraisal in there. Now, if you remember over the last couple of weeks, we did talk about two different ways to have appraisal addendums in the purchase and sale agreement. One was with the financing contingency, and the other one was just an appraisal addendum as a standalone form. So if you have a 22A in your contract and you want to do an additional down payment coverage for that gap that might potentially come up, you're going to check box 1 for the reference with the financing addendum. Now, when it comes to additional down payment, this is additional money that the buyer is going to bring to the table towards the down payment. Remember, everything across the board is kind of going to go up at the same level too. So when you put additional down, you need to make sure that the buyer does have sufficient funds in order to cover that gap. You're going to need to be able to prove they had sufficient funds to cover that gap. Now, the amount that you're going to put in an additional down is going to be the maximum dollar that the buyer is willing to pay in the event that the purchase price and the appraised value do not match. Now, this is a predetermined pre-consent to paying that difference. So if you have an additional down form and the appraisal comes in low, you don't get that chance to negotiate what happens back and forth if the appraisal gap that you put in this form covers that difference. Now, we do need to still give the seller notification that the appraisal gap was needed. So we still are within those timelines of the 3 days to deliver that appraisal to the seller. We do want to let them know that it is needing to be given. So you do have to communicate that. If the seller receives a notice from the buyer that the appraisal is outside the parameters of what this appraisal gap covers, then we will have this sort of conversation ability back and forth. The appraisal gap will only cover the amount that's listed right here. Anything above that gap, you're going to have to negotiate what happens from there. And then it reverts back to the financing addendum rules. So that's laid out in paragraphs 1B and 1C. Now, our default timeline for these conversations back and forth are going to be 3 days. So if you need to change those timelines for any reason, you can go ahead and fill it in on either of those paragraphs. Now, if you are not using a financing addendum, the same thing still applies to the appraisal addendum. Now, the appraisal addendum will also have a spot for you to put, if you check box 2, for additional down. The same rules apply. That is the maximum amount that the buyer is willing to put down. Now, in 2B is that additional amount max. Now, 2A, disclosure of contingent funds. So if the buyer is relying on a loan to purchase the property, but this agreement is not contingent on that buyer's loan, then the buyer is going to pay potentially a dollar amount or percentage of the purchase price down. So you do need to disclose all monies that are going to be paid out. The buyer also needs to know that with an increased purchase price comes increased down payments and increased closing costs. The notice to the seller and the notice to the buyer are both the same in either of these two selections. So if the buyer does become aware that the appraisal value and the bonus funds that they're putting in are not going to cover it, the buyer does need to give a copy of that appraisal. Now, if the buyer waives the appraisal contingency in Form 22AA or even in Form 22A, the buyer is going to be on the hook to purchase the property no matter what the value comes in at. Remember, when we are waiving financing contingencies, we do have that little box that gets checked if the appraisal waiver is going to follow that suit or if it's going to stand alone as its own contingency. We are not able to waive appraisal but not financing. They come together, or you can waive financing but not waive appraisal. At the end of the day, the lender has the final say, and the way to waive it is either by checking the box to do so, by writing it in the contract, or by not having any of these contingencies in place. So let's think about the benefits that this may have. Well, the benefits that I want to look at are for, in a buyer perspective, you're going to show that seller that you have confidence and ability to close if it does not come in at value. It gives the seller a little bit more confidence in accepting an offer that might be above the purchase price, or even just the fact that appraisal is one of the biggest hangups in a purchase and sale. And when it comes to it, at the end of the day, the lender has the final say. So if this is one more hurdle you can get over, it's going to make your offer that much better. On the seller side, the same thing. The seller can have a little bit more breathing room that if the appraisal comes in low, there's a gap coverage to go ahead and take over that. Now, some cautions that you might want to think about are if you represent a buyer and they're doing this appraisal gap, number one, do they have enough money to cover what's going to happen if it comes in at a higher value? Number two, making sure that their maximum value does cover everything else as well, not just additional down payment, but they still have funds at the end of the day to take care of their closing costs and anything else that needs to happen throughout the closing. So just keeping all those numbers in mind and knowing how the appraisal works, make sure that if you use this form, you fill it out with your buyer or seller in mind. I appreciate your attention. And if you have any questions about the appraisal addendum or appraisal gaps, please feel free to reach out.